huge, growth industry in psychiatry in, the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. It, kind of began, the whole, field of biological psychiatry, psychopharmacology. It was completely amazing that small, doses of LSD, could produce, such intense, psychological responses in people. So that got people interested in serotonin and brain receptors and all kinds of things. Thorazine came out at around the same time. Serotonin was discovered at around, the same time. So LSD, was pivotal in, the development of biological psychiatry and psychopharmacology. And, after these drugs got abused or abusable, the government clamped down on their study too.
I was about to ask you what kind of rigorous approval process did the FDA and DEA put you through, just so you could have these studies?
Oh, it was pretty intense. I had to work, fairly much, full time for 2 years to get, the permits for my DMT study. And that was because it had been so long, and the rules and the regulations had changed, and all of the managers at FDA and DEA had changed over the last 20 years or so. So I was interested in resuming studies in psychiatry in an above board honorable way. And despite the fact that human studies had stopped in the early 1970s, animal studies had continued, and there was quite a lot of new information that had been accumulated over those 20 years about the receptors in the brain that are responsible for how psychedelics work. The kinds of biological and behavioral responses that these drugs elicit. So ostensibly, I was interested in confirming or refuting in the human some of the animal data that had come out over the last 20 years. Like for example, do concentrations of endorphin go up after you give DMT to a human, as had been discovered in lower animals. I was also interested in extremely carefully, characterizing, the psychological effects of DMT. The older rating scales and psychological studies of these compounds all kind of emphasized, the psychotic, like qualities of the effect, or the disturbing qualities.
The schizoid type of stuff.
Some people actually, called compounds like DMT schizotoxins or, psychotomimetic drugs. They, kind of mimic psychosis. And, people don't, take these drugs for that reason. They, take them because of their psychedelic effects. So I was interested in, characterizing, the more interesting effects, the ones that are more, sought after and pleasurable. So I developed a, new rating scale, which was more objective and, and kind of neutral in tone, to characterize and to quantify the responses, the psychological responses, to DMT as well.
And how long did the study last? Did you have to get reapproved every year in order to continue?
In terms of getting, the initial DMT study off the ground, that took a couple of years of legwork. And I ran about 3 or 4 DMT studies. After every study was completed, I needed to turn in my report. The government required progress reports every year if the studies weren't completed, by that time. But after I got the studies off the ground with DMT, I also started to, do some studies giving people psilocybin. And, that was, quite a bit easier in terms of, the regulatory and the approval process. That only took, 6 months or so to get, all of, the permits in order. And, we started doing some, dose, finding work with psilocybin. And, so after that, I actually applied, for a study giving LSD to people. And, that only took like 3 months to get the permits, for LSD. So it, was easier each time because the government and I had kind of worked out a routine for getting human studies articulated and approved and off the drawing board. So it, became easier every time.
That brings me to another question that's not on the list, but why was the government so opposed to using DMT versus LSD? Why did they think that LSD was somehow better or easier to approve?
I think that it took 2 years to get the DMT work going because it was the first study of any kind with these drugs of any sort in humans in the U.S. in 20 years. So I actually began with DMT because it was a relatively obscure drug, and it didn't carry the same kind of baggage as LSD.
Stigma.
Yeah, the same kind of stigma. Yeah, so I think if I had begun with an LSD study, it would have been a lot more complicated actually. I was interested in DMT because it was off the radar at the time. And wouldn't kind of draw the same kind of scrutiny as an LSD study.
And you ran into a lot of opposition, didn't you? Whenever you first tried to associate DMT with or the pineal gland, was it the pineal gland with psychedelic experiences?
Oh, well, the whole pineal story is kind of an interesting one. It's kind of bit me on the ass more than once, this whole pineal thing. I was interested in the pineal gland, because it's got an esoteric history over the millennia. It's a, third eye in lower animals. It, has got a, long, illustrious, esoteric, kind of history. Descartes believed it was, the seat of the soul, and it was the organ in the brain through which God communicated with us. And, there are all kinds of interesting compounds and enzymes and components in the pineal gland. So I speculated that there could be psychedelic, compounds in the pineal gland. I even wondered if, perhaps melatonin has some psychedelic effects. So I started a study with melatonin in humans at the University of New Mexico in the mid-1980s. And, we gave a lot of melatonin to lots of people. We suppressed melatonin. We gave small, medium, big doses. And, I was, kind of hoping that, melatonin would have, some psychedelic properties.
But it just made people sleepy, right?
Yeah, it was just, kind of sedating. Even, when we accidentally overdosed, somebody one time, he just became drowsy. That was about it. And so I kind of turned my attention away from the pineal and, any kind of putative, psychedelics, that could exist there, and went straight into the DMT work. In, the DMT book, I speculate about, the pineal making DMT and, being released at, particular, points in time, but it still is a hypothesis. It isn't true. It's not fact. It's not data. I'm collaborating with a group at LSU right now, which has developed a extremely, sensitive way to measure DMT in, tissues and fluids. So we're going to be, turning that, methodology to the, to the pineal gland pretty soon.
Well, maybe we'll have you back on and you can talk about that when y'all are done with it, because that sounds really interesting. How does DMT does DMT affect serotonin or melatonin function? Let's say you use DMT, will it affect your serotonin or melatonin production?
Well, DMT stimulates specific, kinds of, receptors for serotonin in the brain. I think people have looked at, serotonin levels in response to DMT and, in non-human animals, but I can't really remember what the impact was. Serotonin is an abundant, neurotransmitter, so I've, mostly, been interested in the receptors, for serotonin, that DMT attaches to. So that's kind of how, DMT works, is through modifying, the metabolic activity of, certain receptors for serotonin.
Did you ever perform an fMRI?